In 2014, Ubisoft created an open-world shooter set in Kirat, a fictional Himalayan country ruled by a dictator named Pagan Min. But you're just sent in to scatter your mother's ashes. Simple setup. Except that the deeper you go in, the less that holds up. The villain keeps showing mercy he doesn't have to show, and the heroes you're fighting for, they are doing something way worse than even the villain would do. This is Far Cry 4.
I hate when things get out of control. Oh! One fucking chopper, you couldn't fucking do that!
The second and third major players of this game, Amita and Sabal, the co-leaders of the Golden Path, the resistance movement actively fighting to overthrow Pagan Min and ostensibly free Kirit. And on paper, this is your textbook Rebel Alliance setup. Sabal wants to bring back Kirit's old religion and old traditions. He thinks people should follow him because he respects their culture and their faith. That sounds pretty good on paper, right? But here's what he actually does. He uses something called the Tarun Matara, a living goddess, who is really just a young girl who has no real say in her own life. She is used as a religious symbol so people will listen to Sabal and do what he says. He's not winning people over by being a good leader. He's just using their faith against them to control them. Sabal pushes hard for a strategy that involves deliberately destroying Kirit's opium fields, which represent a massive portion of the country's actual functioning economy, specifically as a move to financially cripple Amita's personal power base. This is not a tactic aimed at weakening Pagan Min's regime. This is Sabal willing to economically devastate his own country's rural population purely to win an internal power struggle against his own co-leader. So when you put these methods side by side to plainly Pagan Min's, the supposed dictator, who's extending unearned and deliberate mercy towards a total stranger in the opening minutes of the game, and is repeatedly showing holding back a war he could very plausibly win outright. Sabal, one of the supposed freedom fighters who manipulates a vulnerable young woman's stolen autonomy for religious leverage and is willing to burn his own nation's farmland to spite his own ally. If you genuinely didn't know going in which one the marketing calls the villain, the actions alone don't make that obvious, not even close. On the other side is Amita, represents the modernizer wing. She wants to drag Kirit forcibly into the future, break the population's dependence on old religious superstition, build an actual functioning economy and a real modern fighting force capable of permanently winning this war instead of bleeding it out for another decade. This also sounds pretty good on paper, even more reasonable than Sabal's pitch. But here's what she's willing to do to make that happen faster. As the story goes on, Amita pushes to arm regular people for war, including children. She's fine with putting guns in kids' hands and sending them to fight because she sees it as a necessary cost for winning. And if you fully back her by the end, this isn't just a one-time bad call. It becomes her actual plan going forward. Children, armed, fighting, wars the adults started because the adults refused to end it on their own terms. So Amita talks about progress and a better future, but she's willing to sacrifice kids to go there quicker. When you put them side by side, we see Sabal using a trafficked young girl as a tool of religious control and is willing to burn his own country's farmland just to spite his ally. And Amita wants real progress for Kirit but is willing to arm children as official policy to win faster. On paper, they both talk like heroes, but both of them are willing to hurt innocent people, farmers, young girls, children, to win a power struggle that's really just about which one of them ends up in charge once Pagan Min is gone. Aren't they supposedly becoming the next Pagan Min? Or even worse? When Ajay and his guide Darpan are brought to Pagan Min, they sit at a dinner table where Pagan properly introduces himself to Ajay and explains his intentions. Pagan is noticeably bothered that Ajay doesn't remember who he is and that Ishwari never told Ajay about him. The victim of the killing isn't a random stranger from an old story. It's Darpan, the same man who's been sitting at the table with Ajay the entire scene, punished for getting caught trying to call in rescue. As a demonstration, almost a dark inside joke of the specific restraint he's extending towards Ajay. Pagan gets called away to handle some unrelated crisis, looks Ajay directly in the eyes and tells him, plainly and sincerely, to just stay put, sit in the chair, wait for him to come back, and he'll personally sort out this entire mess. That's the whole opening of the game compressed into one room, and I need you to actually sit with how unusual that is as a piece of writing. The antagonist's very first significant act in the story is an act of mercy, not weakness. He just demonstrated 30 seconds earlier that he is perfectly capable of casual, sudden violence. This is controlled, deliberate restraint extended to a total stranger who holds zero leverage over him whatsoever. He has no practical reason to let Ajay live except that for reasons the game is intentionally withholding from you at this point. And of course, the player doesn't sit in the chair, the open world is right there, the map is unlocked, your curiosity takes over. And the actual game begins the second you walk out that door. If you don't open the map, if you don't leave the room, if you sit about 13 to 15 minutes of real time, Pagan actually comes back. And when he returns, he thanks Ajay for his patience and apologizes for taking so long. Partly because he'd also been dealing with members of the Golden Path who he refers to as terrorists. Then he invites Ajay to join him by the helicopter to finally shoot some goddamn guns, and the game just ends there. Credits roll over. And I want to talk about why this makes the most sense. This is the only choice in the entire game that Pagan actually asks for outright, and the one that costs you nothing. Pagan isn't manipulating you into it with a quest marker or a moral framing. He just asks you to wait and leaves. The one the rational person facing a man who just murdered someone at the same table would actually make is not to provoke the obviously dangerous, obviously armed lunatic holding all the power in the room. Ajay's entire reason for coming to Kirat is stated before any of the politics even start. It was to scatter his mother's ashes because that was her dying wish. Nobody hands him a second objective. The Golden Path doesn't recruit him because he has a cause. They recruit him because his last name is Gali and his blood is useful to whoever can claim it.
This is Ajay Ghale, Mohan's son.
The war was never his war. It became available to him, not assigned to him. The chair ending is the only one where Ajay does the one thing he came to do and then simply leaves, unconscripted, unradicalized, untouched by a war that by every measure the game gives you was never actually his to fight. At the surface, it may actually feel that Pagan is a very heartless, cruel villain. But let us see what Pagan Min has actually built during his time in power. Whatever else is true about this man, a lot of horrible things that are true about the man, Kirat under his rule has actual infrastructure. There are roads connecting regions, there's a standing, organized military with a clear functioning command structure, ranks and discipline. There are checkpoints and administrative control extending across the overwhelming majority of the country's territory. Say whatever you want about the methods that are used to get here, he is running something that resembles an actual functioning, centralized, if brutal, state. It's a proper state. Pagan Min is not obviously the worst option in that lineup. He might honestly be the most restrained person in this entire conflict. That is the trick this game is pulling on you, and it pulls it off so smoothly, so quietly that a huge number of players finish the campaign still thinking of him as just the fun, theatrical, evil guy with the great voice lines and the pink suit. And it's worth pointing out that this pattern doesn't stop after the opening dinner scene. It keeps showing up in smaller moments throughout the entire campaign, in the audio diaries and radio messages he leaves for Ajay to find scattered across the map. Almost like he's narrating his own internal monologue specifically for the one person in Kirat he seems to actually want to understand him. He talks about loneliness, about the isolating burden of ruling somewhere he genuinely sees as broken, about missing the person he once was before the country forced him into becoming whatever he has become. None of that erases the brutality, but none of the brutality erases that either. The game keeps handing you both halves of the same man at the same time for hours, and trusts you that you're sharp enough to hold both halves at once, instead of collapsing him down into a cartoon. Far Cry 4 doesn't flinch. It hands you child soldiers as official policy on one branch. It hands you a manipulated, trafficked teenage girl as a tool of religious control on the other branch, and it hands you in the same breath a dictator who lets a stranger live, builds actual infrastructure, and deliberately pulls his punches in a war he could likely win outright. That's why more than a decade on, people are still making videos exactly like this one. And I truly believe that Pagan Min was secretly the hero and the better choice.